Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Florian North of the University Museum at Hong Kong U. I welcome you very warmly to this first event in a new lecture series that looks at re-examining modernity and contemporaneity through Chinese art. The first talk today will be delivered by Dr. Alina Silnernik of the University of Edinburgh, whose research focuses on contemporary Chinese ink paintings and installations, as well as Western institutional approaches to curating contemporary Chinese ink art. On the latter topic, one that she focused on in her recent PhD dissertation, Alina developed a case study with examples of works by California-based and globally recognized artist Zheng Chongbin. The topic also of her paper today. In addition to academic research and teaching that she does at the University of Edinburgh, Alina also worked previously in contemporary art at Sotheby's in London and in Asian art for Bonhams in Edinburgh. Her presentation analyzes Zheng Chongbin's vision of ink from 1980s reforming China to the global digital artwork. Alina will explain to us her case study of ink works by globally recognized Chinese-born American artist Zheng Chongbin, and she discusses milestones relating to the discovery of Western modern art in 1980s post-Mao China, the widespread phenomenon of migration from China at the turn of the 1990s, as well as the very recent international boom of Chinese ink art in both pictorial and digital media. By encountering firsthand these milestones, Zheng Chongbin formulated his own unique takes on Chinese century-old medium of ink, which demonstrates how ink can be the medium and concept of a much broader international and contemporary relevance. Following Alina's paper, we will have a Q&A session. Our discussant for that will be Dr. Shuo Huo, who is assistant curator at the University Museum at Hong Kong U. Without further ado, over to you, Alina.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this kind introduction. Let me just quickly do my technical setup. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I'm not sure I can share the screen, actually. It's not letting me share the screen. Now I can share the screen. Thank you so much for that. So I think you can all see my PowerPoint now, right?
Yes, thank you.
Excellent. So I'll make it full screen. Right. So I'm very excited to have an opportunity today to share with you some of the elements that are related to my PhD research that I wrote about Zheng Chongbin. As you can imagine, as part of my focus on Zheng Chongbin, I had numerous interviews with the artist. And as part of these interviews, Zheng shared with me various insights into his art, into his career. But I have to say, there was this one phrase that he mentioned to me that perhaps made the most impact upon me and upon my research. So basically, in 4 words, Zheng summarized that overarching goal that stood behind my PhD work. So he said, ink is for everyone. And this is precisely what I was getting at through my PhD research. So my overarching goal was to make this point that contemporary Chinese ink and Chinese ink generally speaking, just because it's this culturally particular medium that has this strong historical, cultural association with China and broader Asia, it doesn't mean that this medium and works in this medium cannot have this broader relatability as well as applicability to international, multinational audiences. So as part of that overarching focus, I specifically looked at the contemporary Chinese ink art's correlation with, as well as reception by primarily the Western art world. So that was like my main focus. And I especially looked at North America and Europe. As part of that, there are obviously lots of different themes, issues, milestones to discuss. But I was interested in looking at 5 specific themes. So first of all, I was interested in checking the 1980s context in post-Mao China in the light of, the opening up to the West and all of that information coming into China during this period about Western art, Western philosophy. Then I was also very interested in checking out this phenomenon of migration that especially happens in the 1990s, and how this experience of moving abroad affected contemporary Chinese ink artists' approaches to their ink art. And then as part of the final 2 themes, I was interested in looking at this recent phenomenon, like this recent rise in international profile of today's Chinese ink works, and how artists go about both contemporizing and internationalizing Chinese ink art. And as part of that, I was specifically interested in checking out the use of digital technologies as one of these creative tools. It's one of these means to help both contemporize and internationalize Chinese ink art. So these 5 themes, they, broadly speaking, relate to numerous important contemporary Chinese ink artists. But I have to say, it's very rare and very difficult to find an artist whose career would relate to all of these 5 issues, 5 themes at the same time. And this was one of the reasons, among other reasons, why I chose Zheng Chongbin's art as my overarching case study. So Zheng was born in Shanghai. In the 1980s, he was in China. He worked in Hangzhou. And then in 1988, he had that life-changing trip to California. His art also uses elements of digital media. So overall, his example of his career development enabled me to have a close look at all of these 5 broader themes that I was interested in exploring in my thesis. So today what I'm going to do, I will touch upon just some of the issues related to these 5 broader themes that I looked at through my work. And then I'm going to use one case study example by Zheng to illustrate each of these 5 themes. So shall we get started? Episode 1, China in the 1980s. So in terms of the broader context, the key idea to mention here is that in the light of Deng Xiaoping's open door policy, there's a lot of information about Western visual culture, Western philosophy that started circulating in China at that time. Once again, because of Deng Xiaoping's open door policy, there are also many foreign students from the West that started coming to study to China. And the Zhejiang Academy, the place where Zheng Chongbin was based in the 1980s, alone welcomed numerous students from Germany, from France, even from Greece, from all of these places in the West and from the Western world. Zheng made friends with many of these Western visiting students who came to China to study calligraphy, Chinese language. But there was this one specific student engaging with whom made perhaps the most impact upon his artistic development in the 1980s, and that is German artist Andreas Schmidt. So in 1985, Schmidt, after a holiday in Germany, brought with him this rare to see in China color catalogue of painting by British artist Francis Bacon. And just to very quickly explain this point, why it was so important that he brought this color catalogue. So even though at the time there is a lot of information circulating about Western art at the time, it was very rare to see high quality, colorful reproductions of paintings. So they were usually black and white and in the form of this very small images. So seeing this color catalog really enabled Zheng Chongbin to study Bacon's brushwork and take on art in more detail. And one of the things that especially resonated with Zheng about Bacon's art is that Bacon, he considered that the most important thing that had to be accurate about art was not this, like naturalistic, three-dimensional mode of representing figures and forms, but the artist had actually to do the opposite, to use this like loose, semi-abstract, expressive pictorial brushwork in order to metaphorically or symbolically accurately represent various physical and emotional states related, to various like human experiences. And that idea was especially important within the context of post-Mao China, because if you think about it, for almost 3 decades, artists had to pursue socialist realist style, which prioritized this like very accurate formal representation, right? Very naturalistic representation. But obviously, when it came to subject matters, there was the lack of accuracy there because it was primarily political propaganda. So the result of this inspiration that Zheng drew from Bacon's art was this. So this is an example of 2 paintings that Zheng produced in the 1980s from the Another State of Man series. So here you can see these like semi-anthropomorphic, semi-animalistic figures. You have like some sort of sense of unease about them. You can't quite see their limbs. They look quite restrained, and it also looks like they're going through some process of perhaps like painful and very uncomfortable readjustment. So this is something that obviously draws a parallel to Bacon's art, because his figures are also represented in this like various uncomfortable, painful like states, going through like this painful like physical transformations that also like stands for some mental anxiety, mental pain and distress. However, just to go back to Zheng's work, even though you sense this like sense of discomfort about these figures, if you have a look at the overall composition, if you have a look at the brushwork, there's also some sense of unity and uniformity about these figures. So even though they look like they might be falling apart, they are in this like process of deformation, disintegration. It also looks like they're holding on together. And there is some sort of sense of resilience about these figures. And once again, this draws a parallel to Bacon's figures. He often represents them, for example, with muscular forms. So even though these figures are represented undergoing this like painful, uncomfortable processes, it also looks like they have that, strength, whether physical and mental, and resilience to withstand those like physical pressures applied upon them. So moving on to another episode now, episode 2, which centers around this theme of migration. So in 1988, as I already mentioned, Zheng moved to San Francisco to pursue his postgraduate studies in fine art. It was a logical thing for Zheng to do because throughout the 1980s in China, Zheng focused on studying Western art. So it was just a logical step for the artist to take to come to the West to study Western art firsthand. So between 89 and 91, Zheng completed the first international fellowship program, and then he did his Master of Fine Arts degree at the San Francisco Art Institute. And of course, during these first few years, while residing in the States, Zheng had to go through this experience that every single migrant, in one way or another, has to go through, that experience of cultural shock. So in one of the interviews, in fact, Zheng mentions to me that when he moved to the West, everything has changed. His experience of, the cultural world, his sense of identity, his feeling about culture. And something else that is quite important to mention. So during this like couple of years that Zheng spent studying at the Institute, most of his like peers, teachers, students, they talked about art as installation art. So Zheng started like questioning how he could continue pursuing painting, and specifically ink painting, against like the background of all of these like artists in San Francisco talking about art as non-painting, as installation art. Something else that is important to mention in terms of context. So another thing that Zheng had to face during this first like few years while he was like settling down in the States, he had like to tackle this issue of his changing sense of cultural identity. Once again, that experience that all of the migrants in one way or another have to go through. And Zheng was also able to see how other artists who were like migrants around him, how they went about expressing their changing sense of cultural identity through their works. I will just give you one quick example. So one of Zheng's teachers, Tony Labat, who is a Cuban-born artist based in the United States of America, in his works, and specifically in his video works at the time, he explored the hardships of migration and cultural assimilation. And another Latin American artist that I just wanted to very quickly mention. So this artist is not migrant. He is a Brazilian artist, and he was based in Brazil. His name was Tunga. And Tunga made a very important impact of a different kind on Zheng during this time. So even though Tunga was based in Brazil, his art was exhibited internationally. He had this international reputation. And in fact, in 1993, Zheng saw his works at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And the thing that like really impressed Zheng about Tunga was how the artist went about using certain references to Brazilian culture in such a way that it also looked very modern. So Tunga is famous for his use of metal wires in his installation art. And these metal wires, they evoke tribal hair, but at the same time, because of their minimalistic imagery, these metal wires also look like some elements of the industrial landscape. So overall, against the background of all of this, Zheng started like questioning how he could use ink in his installation art, and specifically how he could use ink at this moment as a means of commenting on his changing sense of cultural identity. And the result was the following. So this is an example of the work that Zheng produced in the 1990s. This piece, this like rice carpet installation, was exhibited at two places. First of all, it was shown at the Meridian Gallery in San Francisco in 1996, and then it was also exhibited in New York in 1997 at the Hall of Fame Gallery at the Bronx Community College. And so here, Zheng really commented on his, first of all, dual sense of identity at the time as the Chinese-born artist who lived in the United States of America. That's why you have two color components in this work. Can you see like this white squares? So these white squares, they comprise plain rice. And these black squares, they also comprise rice, but rice that was soaked in ink. So the smell of ink was a very characteristic feature about this whole installation. However, this installation is not a simple commentary on the dual cultural identity, because these dualities, when it comes to like the migrant cultural identity, they are never clear cut. They are always full of these, ambiguities and lots of different complex layers. And these ambiguities and complex layers are expressed, metaphorically speaking, by some of the elements that Zheng used in this installation. So if you take the element of rice, for example, one of the key components about this installation. So on one hand, you could argue that rice represents Asian culture because it's a very common food in Asian cuisines, right? But at the same time, rice is also very common to cuisines all over the world, including some of the states in the United States of America. And the same thing, the same kind of ambiguity applies to the chessboard imagery. Some of you may have already noticed that this carpet is arranged in such a way that it looks like a chessboard. So this reference to the game of chess, on one hand, it can be argued to evoke Western cultural context, perhaps like the specific cultural context of the United States of America. But at the same time, chess is the game that is like popular all over the world. And in fact, if you look up the history of chess, it originated in India and then it spread to neighboring Asian countries. So as you can see, something that looks like it's clearly like dual, like it's not really clear cut. And these dualities, they're not straightforward. So it's a very powerful way of commenting on the artist's like personal experience of his like changing sense of cultural identity at the time and all of the ambiguities that accompanied it. In the interest of time, let's move on to another episode now, which is episode 3. And this episode specifically looks at how Zheng went about accommodating ink painting to the local art scene in California. So in terms of the background context, just one thing that I wanted to mention very quickly. So during this period in the late 1990s, you have more and more institutional attempts in the United States of America to challenge the West centrism of American modern art history. So conventionally, it was believed that American modern art was this like unique phenomenon, just like, within the context of the US, implying that American modern artists didn't really borrow or incorporate any elements from other non-Western cultures. And that's why Clement Greenberg, a very famous critic at the time, famously said that American abstract expressionism had no more than a cursory interest in Oriental art, which was, of course, not the case because, as we all know, many American abstract modern artists actively drew inspiration from, for example, Asian visual culture, as well as various like Asian philosophies. So during this period in the later 1990s in the US, you have more of this institutional attempts to challenge this West centrism of American modern art history. And one just quick example is this 1997 exhibition, Asian Traditions, Modern Expressions, curated by Jeffrey Wechsler, which was held across a number of different institutions, including the Chicago Cultural Center. And as part of this like exhibition, as part of the exhibition catalog as well, Wechsler really commented on that inherent interconnectedness between American modern art on one hand, and on the other hand, Asian modern art, as well as Asian traditional visual culture, as well as philosophy. So against the background of this, in the late 1990s, Zheng developed a series of paintings called the Blot series. So here he commented specifically on the interrelationship between Shitao's art and works of various American modern artists, in this case specifically Ed Reinhardt. So Shitao, as many of you know, is famous for the incorporation of like dots, or you can also call them blots in his paintings. So these dots have all kinds of like shapes, and there are so many of them that it looks like they are like moving beyond, the surface of the paper on which they are represented. So this stands for this like wider Chan Buddhist idea of how everything is like ever changing, ever moving in the world, and that's why it's like formless in the sense of being ever moving, ever changing. So you can't quite grasp this static singular form because it's in this constant flux, constant motion. Similarly, Reinhardt also engaged with this like metaphysical, Asian metaphysical idea of how the universe is in constant flux. So in his case, he used them form the shape of the square to do that. So his paintings comprise a series of different squares. Even though they look uniform, they are not uniform. He uses, different like brush strokes to represent the square. So all of the squares are in all kinds of like forms. They're not like totally uniform. And once again, they are expanding beyond the picture frame. because Reinhardt like never painted like any borders around the squares. So once again, it comes down to this idea how everything in the universe is like formless in the sense of being like ever changing, ever moving, ever expanding. So in this work, now let's go back to Zheng's painting. In this work, Zheng references some of these elements which are characteristic of Shitao and Reinhardt's art. So can you see, for example, the way he arranged these blots in his painting? So he used this geometric grid-like arrangement, which is evocative of Reinhardt's art. And then if you have a look at how he represented the individual circular shapes, like, you know, these like clusters of blots, he used this like loose pictorial brushwork. He incorporated like many different layers. And so this is evocative of Shitao's way of like painting these blots using like loose pictorial brushwork and like multiple layers. And the reason why it was important to comment on this interrelationship between Shitao and Reinhardt's art is because, in fact, in 1954, Ed Reinhardt saw Shitao's paintings at this exhibition which took place at the Cleveland Museum of Art, representing Chinese Old Master ink painting. And Reinhardt was so impressed by this exhibition that there's actually a review that he wrote of this show, which is very interesting. You can look it up. It was published in Art News in December 1954. And there, Reinhardt called Chinese traditional landscape ink painting as one of the greatest inventions in human history. And he particularly pointed out the universality of traditional Chinese ink art, and that universality applied specifically to the use of formless washes, and also how many of these like ink paintings engaged, you know, with this like metaphysical ideas related to like being in the wider world, in the wider universe. However, now let's go back to Zheng's painting. This interrelationship between Shitao and Reinhardt's art is commented upon by Zheng not in a purely art historical way. So he uses elements of Shitao and Reinhardt's art as a platform to for his own art. Like he extends these elements and makes them his own as a way of like giving his own take on this metaphysical notion of formlessness in this work. So just to point out some of these like unique like takes that Zheng incorporated in this work. If you pay attention to this like individual blots, you can see that they are quite three-dimensional, they are quite sculptural, because first of all, Zheng goes for numerous layers. And so it gives you this effect of like viewing this almost like three-dimensional objects in physical space. And he also went for them two different textures, and this like texture contrast, you know, adds that greater sense of three-dimensionality. So he used this like softer texture of ink brushwork, and then he also applied acrylic paint, which, you know, almost looks like it sits on top of the paper. And then in fact he also applied ceramic sealer on some of the ink brush strokes, and so that gave them this like sense of luminosity and a greater sense of three-dimensionality. So it almost looks like you're viewing like this abstract circular shapes in this like very animated state, undergoing all of this like process of like formal change, and it's like, you know, ever expanding beyond like the surface of the paper, ever moving and formless in the sense of, you know, being in this constant motion, in constant flux. So now let's move on to another episode, episode 4, which is about this rising international profile of Chinese ink art. So in the post-2000 period, there are more exhibitions that take place both in Asia and in the wider Western world, where there's more emphasis put on contemporary Chinese ink art's international applicability. There are many examples to mention here. I will just mention one quick example, which is really this benchmark event that in the new century, on this large scale, started like this dialogue on the international positioning of contemporary Chinese ink art. And this event is the third Chengdu Biennale, which took place in 2007 in Chengdu. And as one of the curators of this Biennale, Fan Bin, put it even in, like in the exhibition catalog's opening essay, Guohua, by which he means the Chinese ink painting, cannot be simply called painting of China. And then he went on to pose this critical question as to how Chinese ink painting can transform itself in today's international discourse. So there are many takes on answering this question, how to make contemporary ink art more internationally relatable, more internationally applicable. And Zheng's unique take on this question is the following. So Zheng treats ink as this like material agent, and this is especially effectively visualized in this work, which is this light and space installation, Wall of Skies. So for this installation, Zheng had this floor specially built, this like extra reflective floor. He also had this wall sculptural component assembled. So it comprises all of these like different panels, bent at different angles in order, to heighten this light and shadow play. And then he also had his ink and acrylic, his signature style ink and acrylic paintings pasted on these panels. And once again, because you have this like textural and color contrast between black ink, like shimmering black ink, and this like radiant acrylic paint, which has like more of a rigid structure to it, you had this even more heightened like light and shadow play about this like cultural installation on the wall. And something else to mention about this work, so because light is so important here, Zheng had this noteworthy collaboration with the Thora, which is the globally leading lighting company, and they utilize special lamps in this installation like Vivid AR 111 in order to make sure that light in this installation was as animated, as radiant, as bold as possible. And so when the viewer experienced this installation, he or she was like enveloped by all of these like ephemeral shapes that were cut by this like sculpture on the floor. The viewer could also like study all of these like minute light and shadow details about the wall sculpture itself. And so it really activated the viewer's sensorial apparatus. It really made the viewer more like aware of the surroundings around him or her. So it's a very like interesting way of using ink, because ink here is used as this like material agent that captures some of the light reflections and reflects them back. So it's a very like physical, phenomenological, material reinterpretation of the ink medium. Moving on onto another episode, which is the final episode, which looks at specifically how digital technologies can be used to help like contemporize as well as internationalize the contemporary Chinese ink art. So in terms of context, something to mention in relation to Zheng specifically, as probably all of you know, Zheng lives very close to Silicon Valley, and he's also partner and artistic director of Fire, which is this experiential digital content production company based in San Rafael. So basically, like technologies form this like very important backdrop to Zheng's daily life. But as he mentioned to me in one of the interviews, he's only interested in using technologies as far as it helps him underscore that wider subject matter, that wider idea that he wants like to express through his works. And one of these like works in which he was able to very pertinently utilize the language of digital media in order to underscore his wider idea is chimeric landscape. So you can see this work. There are obviously many different ways of installing this work. This is just an example. This is how it was installed in 2015. at Palazzo Bembo in Venice. So you had this one big screen, and then it was surrounded by this like extra reflective walls as well as the floor surface. So once again, the viewer had this quite like enveloping, immersive experience. And the protagonist of this work was ink, the medium of ink, which was once again treated as the material agent. But because due to use of digital technologies, Zheng could incorporate many different scenes here, like representations of the wider natural landscape, or some like snapshots of molecular movements. Because of all of this, like comparative scenes, Zheng was able to underscore this idea of how everything in the wider natural realm is incredibly and inherently interconnected, especially when it comes to viewing things at this like basic biochemical level. And it's very interesting, to position ink within that like new materialist context as part of the wider natural environment, because ink obviously like comprises like very organic materials. It is made from soot, which is taken from burnt pine trees, right? Talking about the wider natural landscape, or from burnt oils. And the same thing goes for paper. Paper is made obviously from like trees or from bamboo. So again, we are talking about this like very organic, natural materials that have this like relevance in one way or another to this wider natural world. I will give you an example, and this point will make more sense once you can see it and you can visualize it. So, for example, during the sort of the video sequence, Zheng, for example, had this snapshot of zigzag lines, which were represented in this like very swift motion. It almost looked like, that was the motion of molecules that you were viewing under the microscope. And then after that, you were represented with motion as well, but another kind of like motion. It was like a zoom out. And you were like taken to this like natural landscape, and you saw like the movement of this like river waves. And then after that, once again, you had the representation of waves, the representation of this water motion, water movement, but now in the pictorial format, in the form of ink on paper. And then after that, you had this scene which looked like liquid ink, and it was undergoing like this like process of like boiling. So you could hear like sounds of like splashing and gurgling, and this would like remind you of this splashing waves of this like river-like feature, which like in turn would remind you of this like zigzag lines and how they're like in this constant like motion. So basically, the more you saw this video, the more like you would start drawing all of these parallels among like various features in this like wider natural landscape. And it all basically comes down to this idea, which is central in the field of new materialism and object-oriented ontology, that everything in the world is inherently like interconnected and full of these like interactions, to use Karen Barrett's term. And as another new materialist exponent, a very famous philosopher of our time, Timothy Morton, put it, the more we know about life forms, the more we recognize our connection with them, and the stranger they become. So the more you know, the more entangled you realize you are, and the more open and ambiguous everything becomes. So once again, ink here is used as this like material agent, as this like example of how everything is like inherently interconnected in the world, especially at this like basic biochemical, biophysical level. So just to summarize very quickly, Zheng's art very patently shows how Chinese ink's broader technical and conceptual possibilities make it the widely resonating medium that can be critically and effectively incorporated into the global contemporary art world. Just to repeat the phrase with which I started today's presentation, something that Zheng mentioned to me, ink is for everyone. It is the medium that any artist can use, and ink works they are not just the matter for the Chinese or for Asian audiences. They are so much more than that. And they can definitely have that much broader, meaningful relatability to this like wider multinational audiences. Thank you very much. And I'm very excited to hear your questions and to have a discussion and, to hear what you think. Thank you. I'll stop sharing my screen and then we can have a discussion.
Please. Thank you, Alina. That was wonderful. It's great to discuss some of the individual works with so much time and your deep knowledge, and also to learn more about his background, of course, and the influences upon his work. For the Q&A session, I will hand over to Shuo. Thank you.
Thank you, Florian. Thank you, Alina, for the very wonderful presentation. It's very thought-provoking and so engaging. We learned so much with a lot of curiosity, and especially on the case study of Zheng Chongbin and the evolution of the artist's many exciting transcultural encounters with the Euro-American, Indian, and historical Chinese art in his creative practices. If I may, I have a few interconnected questions to Alina before we open the floor to the many more wonderful questions. So the first question has to do with context. So Zheng, as well as his peers, were faced with similar socio-historical contexts while rapid changes were taking place in China with ever-evolving transformative Eurasia encounters. Could you please perhaps comment on the socio-political or cultural context which you would consider as the most significant for this generation of ink artists' creative development, and which also foregrounds their individual or collective trajectory of the ink artist community? And in addition to context, the second question has to do with space and location. The desire to carve ink art as a category is multi-layered and quite sophisticated, which can be astutely felt in your research and a lot of the wonderful thoughtful reflections and insight. Could you perhaps maybe elaborate a little bit more on the topic of space and location in your analysis? And finally, the question has to do with stereotype and canon making. Could you please briefly comment on how Chinese ink art has been viewed, perceived, and understood, especially in the Euro-American art world, especially on the phenomenon of certain stereotypes many have held towards Chinese ink art, which could perhaps also be linked to the whole process of canon making in perhaps a lot of the Western art institutions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for these interesting questions. So I'll go ahead and I'll get started with the first question. So talking about like the sense of like artistic community and this like cultural context that had this perhaps like more collective impact upon artists. I think this especially applies to the context of 1980s China, because at that time, artists were exposed to like very similar books and magazines that were circulating about Western art, Western visual culture at the time. And they also worked as part of academies. So they had their studios located next to each other. And so even though they obviously all had their own individual takes on how contemporary Chinese art and specifically contemporary Chinese ink art had to be developed, I think you do get this somehow sense of community within the context of 1980s China. After that, I think all artists have like their own paths and they are based like in all different like places. So perhaps you don't really have that like sense of community anymore. Like somehow artists work more on their own. But in relation to like the contemporary time and what's happening right now, if there was like something like one feature that perhaps like unites some of the artists, perhaps like that would be related to the use of digital technologies, because that's something that has an impact on all of us in one way or another. And even artists who choose not to use digital technologies, it can be argued that it's done in response, to this wider popularity of digital technologies. And I also find it interesting that Calvin Hui, for example, the co-owner of the 3812 gallery in Hong Kong and London, he mentioned like this idea that now we're like really entering this tech ink era, whereby tech and technology can be viewed as like one of those like elements from the wider social cultural context that has an impact on many artists, even though they may not know each other, they may not work in collaboration with one another, but perhaps it's interesting to see them as part of this like tech community, so to say, and to understand how digital technologies impact artistic creation at the time. Speaking about your second question, so about space and location, right, and how important these are. So when we think about like specific like geographic locations, I think once again it applies more to like the pre-2000 period. So obviously in 1980s China, you have a very like strong sense of like location. Artists are based in like this country that is undergoing like tremendous changes in the post-Mao period. So all of this like events that relate to this like locality to location, they indirectly or directly impact this artist, right? And then the sense of like location and the importance of these geographic locations also impacts artists when they move abroad. So if you take, for example, the context of 1990s and even 1980s, many artists started moving abroad in the 1980s from China. So when they went to those like specific places like New York, San Francisco, Paris, obviously like the locality had a huge impact upon them, and they had to integrate into those like local social cultural context. So this is really where like these geographies play a very important role. But if you take the contemporary like period, like what's happening right now, so in the post-2000 period, I'm not sure how useful it is to think in terms of like localities. Obviously, like they still do play a role, but at the same time, artists are so like literally global now. They can travel around the world. They can have their exhibitions posted on the web with the use of digital technology. So when we talk about like curating on the web, you don't really have like any territories there. It's like territorial, right? So perhaps like in the contemporary context, especially like in the post-COVID perhaps stage where there's so much emphasis put on this like digital exhibitions, perhaps thinking about locations doesn't always work. And the third question was about stereotypes, right? So stereotypes around Chinese ink art. That's a very interesting question. I mean, that was really at the core of my PhD thesis, to touch upon all of these stereotypes and to deconstruct them in relation to Chinese ink art. So one of the stereotypes in the Western art world in relation to Chinese ink is of the cultural nature. So just because you have Chinese before ink, many audiences will automatically think that it's not for them because they're not Chinese, they're not Asian, or they don't understand anything about like Chinese or Asian cultures. So many audiences still like don't understand that just because it's a Chinese ink artwork, it doesn't mean that it doesn't have that broader relatability, that it can't be relatable to them, even though they're not like Chinese or Asian. So there are these like cultural stereotypes. And another like quick stereotype that comes to my mind is related to the materiality of ink painting, specifically ink painting, because ink paintings are on paper, right? So these are like works on paper. And so in the Western world, they're usually classified as types of drawing rather than painting and fine art. And I also find it so interesting. So obviously so many artists use ink, not only like Chinese and Asian artists. I mean, look at some of the American modern artists like Mark Toby or the Belgian French artist Henri Michaud. All of them have ink on paper work. And then if you look at how their ink on paper works are classified by Western museums, they put into the category of drawings, and their oil paintings are put into the category of fine art and painting. But viewing ink painting as drawing is not right, because it is fine art, it is painting. It's not just like, just because it utilizes paper doesn't mean that you can just like downgrade it to like this like type of like drawing, sketching. It's not that. So there are this like still certain stereotypes revolving around ink painting in relation to its like, you know, materiality and the fact that it like works on paper. I hope I answered all of your questions and all of the points that you raised.
Yes, brilliantly. Yes, very well. Thank you. Because time is limited, so I will need to go. We may invite more questions now. So if you have questions, please send us direct message to Elena. And while at the same time, we have one very interesting question from Dr. Pan Yang, who will actually give a presentation at Hong Kong UMAG in March as our second speaker. So Pan asked, "Thank you, Alina, for the truly engaging talk. I was wondering how you define ink medium art in the title of your very recent dissertation. How is it different from ink art? Bracket, if there is any difference, bracket. Does the ink medium art include those artworks that use ink and other mixed materials? And does ink medium art also include, for instance, Zhu Jingshi's installation tile of rice paper?"
Yeah, so my understanding of ink medium art is very, very broad. And in fact, I took the definition from Maxwell Hearn's catalog. So in 2013, Maxwell Hearn curated a groundbreaking exhibition, Ink Art, Past is Present in Contemporary China, at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And there he called ink works as ink art, because art implies that it can be anything. It can be digital media, it can be installation art, and it can be works on paper. So the way like I defined ink, contemporary ink works in my thesis also was like in the light of this like very broad and all-encompassing definition that it can be anything, and it doesn't have to be even like limited to specifically like works on paper. So ink medium, it's not just about like the material qualities, it's also about the conceptual qualities. So sometimes you can have like ink works that don't literally incorporate ink on paper, but because they evoke the aesthetics of ink medium art, I think in my personal opinion, you can still call these works as like ink art. So my understanding of ink art is very broad, very encompassing, all-encompassing. And it doesn't have to be limited obviously just to like ink paintings. It can be anything that relates to ink techniques as well as ink concepts, ink aesthetics. So ink medium is this very broad term for me personally.
Thank you very much.
The question.
Yes, Pan replies, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
That is a very interesting question. Thank you.
I do not see that there are any more questions coming in. Maybe I should pass the microphone to our moderator, Dr. Florian Knopf.
Thank you, Sho, and thank you, Alina, again for your talk and for your even more engaging answers to the questions. It's excellent to extend in this way and to overwhelm us even more with your knowledge. Thank you for that. I thank all the participants for joining us today and invite you to the second lecture on March 31st, the one by Pan Yang, who just asked. She is at Source and she will speak to us in about 5 weeks' time. Thank you again, Alina. This was a wonderful online lecture. As we said earlier, we hope to welcome you to Hong Kong sometime soon when things are better. And we wish you a good spring in Edinburgh. Thank you very much. Thank you all for joining us
For
today.
having me. I was so excited to have this opportunity, to share some elements about my research. And I hope next time we can meet in person. We can start traveling all more freely. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you, Sho.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for wonderful questions, and thank you for the discussion and moderating everything.
Thank you so much to Florian and Alina and for a lot of the colleagues at the UMAG. It's been wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.